So, Family Guy has been doing this thing since basically the beginning, where it sneaks something genuinely unsettling into an episode and then just moves on, like nothing happened. The show will spend 12 minutes doing absurdist gag comedy, cutaways about nothing, Peter hurting himself in creative ways, and then right in the middle of all of it, something will happen that's actually a bit dark. Not dark in a winking, ironic way, just dark. And the show doesn't acknowledge it. It doesn't put a bow on it. It just keeps going. I find that oddly fascinating, honestly. It's part of why the show has lasted as long as it has. 24 seasons, somewhere between 447 and 450 episodes depending on which platform you ask, which is a number I always find slightly staggering when I think about it. That's a lot of television, and buried in all of that, if you know where to look, there are episodes that have no real business being as disturbing as they are. The sheer quantity of material is worth dwelling on for a second. Most TV shows that run 10 seasons are considered extraordinary longevity. Family Guy has run more than double that, which means that even if the writers spent 90% of those episodes on pure comedy, cutaways, gags, Peter getting injured in new ways, the remaining 10% is still a substantial body of work. There's a lot of dark territory in the catalogue, more than the show's reputation would suggest, and more than I think even dedicated viewers always keep track of. Tonight we're going to take a quiet, unhurried wander through the scariest, most horror-adjacent corners of this particular cartoon universe. We're talking about haunted houses and serial killers, Stephen King adaptations and Terminator knockoffs, a Silence of the Lambs parody that somehow works, episodes about domestic violence that the show handles with more care than you'd expect from something that also has a running gag about a man being violently injured by a giant chicken. There's a lot of ground to cover, and none of it needs to be rushed. If you haven't watched Family Guy in a while, don't worry about it. These episodes stand on their own reasonably well, and I'll fill in the context as we go. If you watch it all the time, then you'll probably already have opinions about some of what I'm going to say, which is fine. Come along anyway. The show premiered in January 1999. Created by Seth MacFarlane, who was 25 years old at the time, which is the kind of fact that makes you feel slightly inadequate depending on where you are in life. The original run was cancelled by Fox in 2002, which is probably the most well-documented near miss in animated television history. It came back in 2005 on the strength of DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, and it has been going ever since. The revival is now longer than the original run was, by quite a bit, and the show was renewed again in April 2025 through season 28, so it will still be running in 2029 at the earliest. Whatever your feelings about that, it's objectively an extraordinary run for any television show, animated or otherwise. The vast majority of shows don't make it past season 3. This one is going to make it to season 28. The cast is the same core group it's always been. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Stewie, Brian and Quagmire. Alex Borstein is Lois. Seth Green is Chris. Mila Kunis is Meg. Mike Henry voiced Cleveland for many years before stepping away in 2020. Patrick Warburton has been Joe Swanson since the beginning, and honestly, the idea of anyone else doing that voice is genuinely difficult to process. These are familiar voices in the most literal sense. If you've watched this show at any point in your life, hearing them talk is probably one of the more immediately comforting sounds in your personal television vocabulary. That's not an accident, that's what we're using tonight. The horror episodes, and I use that term loosely, tend to cluster around a few different types. There are the genuine genre parodies, the Poltergeist episode, the Stephen King anthology, the Silence of the Lambs segment. These are the show playing dress-up with horror iconography and generally doing a better job of it than you'd expect from an adult animated comedy. Then there are the episodes that arrive at something genuinely dark through the back door, so to speak. The domestic violence story, the serial killer brother, the accidental murder at an abandoned asylum. These aren't horror episodes in the traditional sense, but they stick with you in a similar way. And then there are the Halloween episodes, which have their own distinct flavour. Chaotic, multi-threaded, often genuinely funny, occasionally deeply strange. We'll get to all of them. And since we're here, let's just say the obvious thing. Horror is actually quite good sleep content, when it's the right kind of horror. Not the keep you up at night kind. Not the sort that puts a genuine image in your head that refuses to leave. The sort where you know the outcome, where the danger is performed rather than real. Family Guy horror is all of those things. You know Peter is going to be fine. The suspense, such as it is entirely structural. You're following a story whose ending you can intuit within the first 5 minutes. That's not a criticism, that's a comfort. The show is dark enough to be interesting and familiar enough to be comfortable. These are also, for what it's worth, episodes I find myself thinking about more than the funnier ones. Not always the most successful things the show has done, but the most interesting. The ones that suggest there's more going on in Quahog than the surface level allows, right? So if you're new here and you're enjoying this, the subscribe button is somewhere on your screen. Worth a click. And now, let's properly get into it. Before we dive into the specific episodes, I want to take a minute to talk about what makes this show capable of going dark at all. Because it does go dark. More than people give it credit for, I think. And it's not dark in the same way as, say, a show that sets out to be dark. It's dark in a more incidental way, which is actually more interesting. The show operates on what you might call a tonal paradox. Its default register is complete absurdism. Cutaways that have nothing to do with the plot. Peter fighting a giant chicken in the middle of an episode for 5 minutes straight. Quagmire's entire existence as a character. The show can be completely unserious for extended periods of time. And then it will just, without warning, do something that lands differently. Not louder, not announced, just different in quality. The giant chicken fights are probably the most visible expression of this paradox, actually. They're completely unrelated to whatever episode they appear in. They're extraordinarily violent in the way cartoon violence is. They're spectacular, and they have no consequence whatsoever. The chicken and Peter both survive every fight, and the next time they meet, they have another one. This is the show's relationship with violence in miniature. It can be enormous, operatic, and completely inconsequential, all at the same time. The horror episodes are interesting precisely because they sit outside that understanding. In the horror episodes, things have consequences. The violence matters, the darkness accumulates, the show can't fully reset at the end. That's what makes them different. The Poltergeist episode, which we're getting to shortly, is a good example of this. It's structured as a parody. It's got jokes throughout. But it also has a moment where Lois goes into the ghost realm to bring Stewie back, tied to a rope, and there's something in that moment that isn't really played for laughs. The show doesn't make a big deal of it, it just lets it be what it is. That choice to allow a moment of genuine feeling inside a comedy is what makes Family Guy more interesting than it sometimes gets credit for being. Seth MacFarlane has talked in various interviews about his influences, and they're broader than people assume. Classic Hollywood, old radio comedy, mid-century animation, but also, and this is relevant for tonight, a genuine affection for genre film, including horror. That affection shows up in how the show handles parody. The Silence of the Lambs segment isn't just referencing the film, it's actually engaging with it. The Three Kings episode doesn't just wave at Stephen King, it reconstructs 3 of his stories, with enough care and detail that they work as standalone pieces. For a comedy show, that's a meaningful level of commitment. MacFarlane's own relationship with mortality is also, I think, relevant context. He was booked on one of the flights that was hijacked on September 11th, 2001, and missed it due to a clerical error and a hangover. He has spoken about this in various ways over the years, sometimes with dark humour, sometimes more seriously. But what's interesting is that the near miss seems to have given him a relationship with death that's more direct than the average person's. Not morbid exactly, just less afraid of it. And the show reflects that. Family Guy doesn't treat death as taboo. Characters die. Characters come back. Death himself has appeared as a recurring guest. The show has always been comfortable sitting with mortality in a way that a lot of primetime television isn't. That comfort with death, with darkness, with the genuinely unsettling, is what makes the horror episodes possible. There's also something specific about the physical world of Quahog that enables the darker episodes. The show has always treated Quahog as a real place. It has geography. The drunken clam is down the street from the Griffin's house. The Pewter Schmidt estate is on the other side of town. The Quahog Police Department is where Joe goes to work every day. It has weather. It has institutions, a hospital, a church, a school, an asylum. The specificity of the place means that when something dark happens there, it happens somewhere. The haunted burial ground is under a real backyard. The abandoned asylum is in a real part of town. The woods where the guys bury the caretaker are woods you could find on a map. That groundedness, even in an animated, clearly fictional world, gives the horror something to push against. There's also something specific about animated horror that's worth acknowledging. Horror in animation operates differently than live-action horror. It can't rely on physical threat the way live-action can. You can't make a cartoon feel genuinely unsafe. What it can do instead is use the contrast between the cheerful, colourful visual language of animation and the content of what's actually happening to create dissonance. A cheerful, Saturday morning cartoon aesthetic wrapped around a story about a serial killer is disturbing in a different way than a straight horror film would be. Family Guy has always understood that intuitively, even if it doesn't necessarily articulate it. There's a comparison to be made here with the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episodes, which have been doing animated horror parody since 1990 and are in many ways the template that all subsequent animated shows have worked from. Family Guy's approach is different though. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are explicitly outside the main continuity. They're labelled as Halloween specials. They don't count. Family Guy's dark episodes aren't labelled. They just are. The horror lives inside the regular episode format, without a frame to contain it. The show doesn't give you the safety of knowing it's a special. It just starts with someone getting haunted or murdered and carries on from there. That's a different kind of commitment. It means the darkness has to coexist with everything else the show is doing. The Peter getting fat subplot has to share screen time with the serial killer. The Halloween prank war has to run alongside the genuine moment of dread. There's no separation, and the result is something tonally unusual, not quite horror, not quite comedy, something that lives in the overlap and is more interesting because of it. The other thing that gives the show its particular flavour of darkness is the characters themselves. Peter Griffin is in many respects a genuinely terrible person. Not in a cartoonish way, in a specific, recognisable way. He's selfish, impulsive, often cruel to his family, and the show doesn't always let him off the hook for it. Quagmire is presented as a character with no boundaries whatsoever, and the show both celebrates and occasionally interrogates that. Stewie is, canonically, a murderous genius infant who has built multiple devices designed to kill his mother. Brian is a dog who has never had a single, stable relationship in his life. These are not safe, comfortable characters underneath the comedy exterior. They have real edges, and the darker episodes tend to find those edges and press on them. The Screams of Silence episode, the domestic violence one, works because Quagmire's protective instincts feel real. We've watched him with his family before. The episode earns its emotional weight because the show has spent years establishing who these characters are. That's not nothing. That's actually quite good writing, even if it's sometimes hard to hold that thought alongside the chicken fights and the Conway Twitty cutaways. One more thing before we get into the episodes. The show's use of familiar secondary characters, Herbert the old neighbour, Mort Goldman the pharmacist, Mayor Adam West, Bonnie and Joe Swanson, means that even the darkest episodes have a populated world around them. You're never watching strangers. You're watching people you've spent, at this point, hundreds of hours with. That familiarity is part of what makes the horror stick. When something bad happens to a familiar face, or in a familiar setting, the effect is different than if it happened in a vacuum. The show has been building Quahog for over 2 decades. It knows the geography. It knows where to place a threat for maximum effect. Anyway, I find all of this genuinely interesting to think about, but we should probably actually get into the episodes now. Season 4 of Family Guy aired in 2005 and 2006. The show had just come back from its cancellation, and there was a looseness to it, a willingness to go bigger, stranger, more committed to the bit, that I think comes from the writers knowing they'd been given a second chance and deciding to use it properly. Peter Geist is from that season, and it might be the most ambitious thing the show attempted in its revival era. It's a full committed Poltergeist parody, and it mostly works. The original Poltergeist came out in 1982. It was a genuine cultural event at the time. Produced by Steven Spielberg, directed by Tobe Hooper, it managed to be both a mainstream commercial success and a film that genuinely disturbed people in a way that horror films don't always manage. The central idea that the suburban home, the safest possible space, is also a portal to something terrifying, resonated deeply with audiences. The family in the film is ordinary. Their house is ordinary. Their neighborhood is ordinary. The horror invades the ordinary without warning and without explanation. That's the template Family Guy is working from, and it's a good one. The setup is simple, as these things tend to be. Joe Swanson builds a home theatre room. Peter, being Peter, cannot allow Joe to have something he doesn't have, so he decides to build a multiplex in his backyard. This involves digging, and while digging, Peter finds a skull wearing a Native American headdress buried in the ground. Brian immediately tells him to put it back. Brian is right about things approximately 40% of the time on this show, and this is firmly one of those times. The skull belongs to a deceased chief. The land is a burial site, and disturbing it is going to cause problems. Peter does not put it back. He takes it inside and starts using it as a prop. There's a dynamic here that runs through most of the show's darker episodes. Brian as the voice of reason, Peter as the force of chaos, and the gap between them as the engine of the plot. Brian's role in Family Guy is often that of the character who sees what's coming, who identifies the problem, states it clearly, and is completely ignored. He's been doing this throughout. It never works. The show has built an entire comedy structure on the inefficacy of sensible warnings. In Peter Geist, that structure has consequences. Brian says put it back, Peter doesn't. The haunting happens. The narrative is structured as a proof of Brian's correctness, which the show then immediately undermines by making the solution involve Carrot Top. There's a scene shortly after where Lois walks into the bathroom and finds Peter urinating into the skull, and he explains, completely seriously, that he was doing no such thing and is actually walking all the way to the bathroom to do it there. This is the level of man we're dealing with. The haunting begins gradually. Stewie starts talking to the television static, which is the first genuinely unsettling image in the episode. A baby standing in front of a screen full of noise, holding a conversation with something that isn't there. Then the furniture starts stacking itself. The chairs and the refrigerator arranged upside down on the kitchen table in perfect formation. And Lois, brilliantly, decides that she must have accidentally stacked all those things and then forgot about it. The denial is one of the funnier running jokes in the episode, but it's also a recognisable thing. The way people explain away evidence of something impossible because the alternative is worse. The furniture stacking sequence is one of the better visual gags in the episode. There's something inherently funny about household objects arranged with impeccable precision in the wrong place, a kind of surreal tidiness about the haunting that the show leans into. Ghosts, apparently, are very organised. Overnight, things escalate. There are hands moving across the floor. There are sounds from inside the walls. the television static expands, and Stewie, still completely unbothered by any of it, keeps having his conversations with the TV as if this is perfectly normal, which in Stewie's case, it possibly is. The baby who has been plotting to kill his mother since the pilot is apparently quite comfortable with supernatural activity. No notes. Chris gets attacked by an evil tree. This is directly from the original Poltergeist, and the show commits to it fully. It's played for laughs, but the image itself is legitimately creepy. This enormous gnarled thing reaching through the window at a frightened kid. What makes the Family Guy version slightly different is that Herbert, the creepy old neighbour, is the one who saves Chris, which adds a layer of darkness the original film didn't have, because now you have to think about what Herbert's motivations might be for keeping a close watch on Chris Griffin at all times, up to and including during a supernatural event. The show doesn't comment on this. It doesn't need to. Herbert has been one of Family Guy's most consistently uncomfortable recurring characters since his first appearance. He is on the surface a kindly old man. His interest in Chris is never made fully explicit, but it is unmistakable, and the show has never pretended otherwise. In most episodes, Herbert functions as a dark joke that the show doesn't quite follow through on. In this episode, though, there's something almost classically gothic about him. The protector, whose protection you're not entirely sure you want. He saves Chris from the tree. Chris is alive. Nobody is entirely pleased about this. And then Stewie gets sucked into the closet. This is the poltergeist moment. The portal opens, the light pours out, and the baby goes through. It's surprisingly faithful to the original, which came out in 1982, directed by Tobe Hooper and produced by Steven Spielberg, became one of the defining horror films of the decade. Family Guy recreates the visual with enough detail that you feel the reference land properly. The family hires a spiritual medium. The medium in the original Poltergeist is Tangina, played memorably by Zelda Rubinstein. In Family Guy, the medium arrives and opens with, "Hey, how y'all ghosts doing? Y'all got a little friend of ours named Stuart up there?" Which is maybe the most casual approach to communicating with the dead I've ever seen depicted. It works. The medium establishes that the entrance to the spirit world is Stewie's closet, and the exit is Meg's backside, which is exactly the kind of joke this show has been making about Meg since the beginning, and hasn't gotten any less mean. I want to say a small thing about the Meg joke here. The show has spent so long establishing Meg as the family's designated scapegoat that it's earned the ability to use that in genuinely dark contexts. The exit is Meg detail in this episode isn't just a cheap shot, it's also a way of saying that the family will use Meg instrumentally even in a supernatural crisis, that their default treatment of her persists even at the end of the world. That's darker than a straight insult. The show knows it, even if it doesn't pause to acknowledge it. The night passes with everyone waiting for Stewie to find his way back. He doesn't. Lois, in the morning, can't take it anymore. She volunteers to go in after him. What I actually want to mention about this episode, because I think it gets overlooked, is the moment where Lois volunteers to go in after Stewie. Tied to a rope, stepping into the portal herself. It's played quickly and without much fanfare, but it's also one of those moments where the show lets a character do something that feels genuinely brave, or at least genuinely parental, without undercutting it. Lois goes in. She finds Stewie, she brings him back. The show doesn't make a big deal of that. The ghost realm itself is rendered simply, dark, distorted, the visual language of bad dreams more than classical horror. Stewie has been wandering in it. He's fine characteristically. He's been conducting his own explorations with the curiosity of a toddler who doesn't fully register danger, which is both funny and, in a strange way, comforting. Stewie is never in genuine peril. Not really. The show has established this character as too formidably capable to be defeated by ghosts. When they come back out, the spirits come with them. The house starts collapsing, the family runs, and then famously, they drive away without Meg. There's a line that Peter delivers as they're leaving. Damn it, we both agreed, remember? If we can only save 2, we leave Meg. And the timing on it is perfect. In a horrible way. They committed to this plan. They actually discussed it in advance. That's somehow darker than if it had been impulsive. The drive to Quagmire's house, seeking temporary shelter, reveals Quagmire in the middle of something complicated in his bedroom. The shot is brief, and the door is immediately closed. No one asks questions. The show relies on suggestion and the imagination of the audience, which is usually more effective than anything explicit would be. The resolution involves Carrot Top. I'll say that again. The resolution of this poltergeist parody involves Carrot Top. The skull ended up in the dump, got cleaned out by a prop comedian, specifically and deliberately Carrot Top, not a prop comedian, the show names him. And the family has to go to his mansion and retrieve it. There's a chase through a hall of mirrors. It's absurd in the best way. The skull gets reburied. The house comes back. Peter, immediately, upon returning home, makes a gesture toward the skull that suggests he's about to commit the same mistake all over again. And then the episode ends. Here's a small detail I always appreciate. The show trusts the audience to know that Peter is going to ruin it again. It doesn't show him actually doing it. It just ends on the gesture, on the implication, and leaves the rest to your knowledge of who Peter Griffin is. 20-something years of Peter Griffin being Peter Griffin has given the show the ability to make jokes through implication alone. The original Poltergeist came out in 1982 and allegedly suffered from what became known as the Poltergeist Curse, a series of tragic events that befell the cast in the years following the film's release. The Family Guy version has no such curse. It has Carrot Top. Whether that's better or worse is genuinely hard to say. A few things I find interesting when I think about Petergeist as a whole. The episode is unusual in the show's run because it sustains a single horror premise for almost its entire runtime. Family Guy typically interrupts its plot threads with cutaway gags. The classic structure of "this reminds me of the time," and then 3 minutes of something completely unrelated. Petergeist uses fewer cutaways than most episodes. It stays in the story. It commits. Whether that was a deliberate choice to serve the horror premise or just how the episode happened to come together, the effect is a kind of narrative weight that Family Guy episodes don't usually have. You feel the haunting accumulate. You feel the house filling up with something wrong. That accumulation is how horror works properly. Not the individual scare, but the building of pressure over time. The furniture stacking itself is strange. The talking to the TV is strange. The tree attack is violent. Stewie disappearing is frightening. Each event lands harder because the previous ones softened the ground. The show understood this and used it, inside a structure that's usually allergic to sustained narrative pressure. Still in season 4, and this one's interesting because the horror lives entirely in the B-plot. The A story is Peter going to the doctor, being told he's fat, refusing to believe it, and attempting to prove his fitness by hula hooping in the doctor's office. It goes badly. None of that is where the dark stuff is. The dark stuff starts when Lois, cleaning up a fallen family portrait, notices that the photograph has been folded, deliberately folded to hide someone. There's a boy in the picture she doesn't recognize, a boy who, as far as she knew, didn't exist. The show does something smart here. The discovery is almost casual. Lois isn't investigating. She's cleaning up a mess. The photograph reveals its secret by accident, the way family secrets usually do, not through dramatic confrontation, but through some small, domestic, unremarkable moment where the carefully arranged concealment finally slips. The portrait fell because Peter knocked it over doing something stupid. The something stupid led to the revelation. The show's causation is always slightly absurd, and this is no exception. Her father denies everything. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's extraordinarily wealthy and frequently reprehensible father, looks her in the eye and says there's no missing kid. She goes to their house at night to look at the family records, The show giving us this image of Lois creeping through her parents' darkened home while both of them sleep, oblivious. She finds the file. His name is Patrick, and the address on file isn't a house. It's a mental institution. Chris, when Lois goes to visit, asks his uncle Patrick the question everyone else is too polite to ask. Why do you live in a crazy house? Which is genuinely what a child would say, and it lands differently than a polite adult inquiry would. Patrick explains that he was traumatized as a young child, sent to the home to recover, and figures the family simply forgot about him. He seems fine mostly. There's something slightly off around the edges, but nothing you can immediately name. Lois takes him home. Brian has concerns. The concerns are not addressed. This is a running beat in the episode that I think is worth dwelling on slightly. Brian is right about Patrick from the beginning. Brian has his reservations, voices them clearly, and is completely ignored. It's not that the family can't hear him, it's that the pull of the narrative, Lois wanting a brother, wanting something she didn't know was missing from her life, is stronger than the evidence Brian is presenting. This happens in real life too, fairly often. The desire for something to be fine can be more powerful than the signals that it isn't. The first real red flag, beyond the general context of Patrick having been in a psychiatric institution, is his wife. He introduces her to the family. Her name is Marion. She is sitting right next to him, he insists. There is no one there. Lois plays along. Brian does not look happy about this, but then Brian rarely looks happy. So, the thing about Patrick's storyline is that the show actually gives him a backstory that earns some sympathy. He was traumatized as a child, the specific trauma being related to overweight men in a way the episode depicts through flashback. It's genuinely upsetting, the flashback, in a way the show doesn't always commit to, and then his family quietly committed him and moved on with their lives. That's the horror underneath the horror, not the serial killing, the institutional neglect. The fact that Carter Pewterschmidt, who is cartoonishly evil in most episodes, could fold a photograph and erase a person from a family photo and just carry on. That detail is darker than any of the murders. Carter is one of those Family Guy recurring characters who functions as a kind of concentrated emblem of a particular type of person. Old money, entitled, immune to consequences, capable of enormous cruelty when his preferences are inconvenienced. He's funny as a caricature, but episodes like this one reveal that the caricature is built on something real, the actual history of wealthy families quietly erasing inconvenient members. Institutionalization as a family management tool, the photograph folded to hide a face. These aren't invented things. The show found a dark, real-world practice and dropped it into its cartoon universe without softening it much. Peter, in a move that should surprise no one, accidentally re-traumatizes Patrick. He puts together a fat activist coalition, starts a campaign in support of overweight people, and then shows up at Lois's family home in a costume that exactly matches the man from Patrick's childhood trauma. He's doing an impression. He doesn't know. The damage is done. The next day, there's a news report about a local overweight man who has been murdered. The suspect's sketch looks exactly like Patrick, and Patrick is currently living in the Griffin house, sharing a roof with Peter, who is himself quite overweight. What I appreciate about this episode is that Peter's obliviousness functions as a genuine plot device here, rather than just a comedic one. The danger is real. There's a serial killer in the house, and Peter is so thoroughly disconnected from the reality of the situation that he never perceives the threat. He wanders around in blissful unawareness while everyone else slowly pieces together what's happening. It creates this odd tension where the comedy and the genuine menace are running simultaneously, and neither quite cancels the other out. There's also a scene where Peter, trying to prove he isn't fat, attempts to hula hoop in the doctor's office, and the hula hoop knocks a family portrait off the wall, and that's what starts the whole Patrick storyline. The portrait falling, the photograph being examined, the fold being noticed, the chain of causation is deeply stupid and also very tight. Peter's stubbornness about his weight directly causes the discovery of a hidden brother who turns out to be a serial killer. The show did that in one scene, casually. Brian figures it out, tells Peter, and the chase begins. Patrick flees into the woods. The group splits up, which is perhaps not the ideal strategy when dealing with someone who has just murdered a person. And then Patrick finds Lois and Brian, and the thing that eventually stops him is genuinely clever. They threaten his imaginary wife. They threaten Marion, and it works because Marion is real to Patrick, and the threat to her is real to Patrick. And Patrick loves her in whatever way he's capable of loving. And that's actually quite a sad thing to sit with. There's something that the show does in this moment that I don't think it gets enough credit for. It treats Patrick's delusion with a kind of respect, not the delusion itself. The show doesn't endorse imaginary wives as a healthy coping mechanism, but the love behind it. Patrick created Marion because he needed someone. He's been in an institution for most of his life. He was forgotten by his family. Marion is what he built in place of what he lost. And when Lois and Brian use her as leverage, they're not just using a tactical weakness. They're using the most real thing Patrick has. The episode knows this. It doesn't say it, but it knows it. He agrees to go back to the institution. He's sorry. He never wanted to hurt Lois. The show lets that be real for a moment. The genuine, complicated regret of a damaged person who has done terrible things and knows it. And then Peter scares him one last time on the way out, because the show cannot entirely resist, and Patrick runs shrieking into the night. The episode ends with Peter being diagnosed with obesity and insisting it's impossible. The tonal swing from serial killer brother back to Peter's weight is vintage Family Guy. It happens in about 4 seconds, and the show acts as if both things were equally weighted, which is its own kind of audacity. There's a version of this episode where Patrick's story gets the full dramatic treatment it arguably deserves. But that's not what Family Guy does. What Family Guy does is put a genuinely dark story next to a completely unrelated comedy story and let them sit together and be weird in combination. And oddly, that works. The Patrick storyline hits harder for being surrounded by the Peter obesity jokes, not less hard. The contrast does something. The episode also does something small at the very end that I think is underappreciated. Peter gets his obesity diagnosis confirmed, accepts it with completely false stoicism, and then the show just ends. No resolution, no growth. Peter is still Peter. Patrick is gone. The Griffin house is quiet again. The family's fine, in the way they're always fine, which is to say, fine on the surface, with a lot of things underneath that nobody is going to acknowledge. That's Quahog in miniature. That's how it always goes. The dark thing happens, the comedy reasserts itself. The next episode starts and nobody mentions it. That quality, the show's ability to absorb darkness and return to baseline again and again, without the baseline ever quite feeling as simple as it did before, is the thing that makes Family Guy worth watching carefully. Not just the jokes, the accumulation, the residue. Season 7, 2009. This is the one I genuinely consider to be one of the show's underrated achievements. Not because it's the funniest episode, it might not even crack the top 20, but because it's structurally ambitious in a way the show doesn't always get credit for, and it mostly pulls it off. It's worth saying something about Stephen King before we get into the episode itself, because the choice of King as the source material is interesting. King is, in some sense, the most accessible, serious author in the American canon. His books sell in enormous quantities. His stories have been adapted into dozens of films and TV series, and his name is synonymous with a certain kind of populist horror storytelling that operates at the intersection of terror and sentiment. The Body, Misery, and The Shawshank Redemption are 3 of his best regarded pieces, and they cover 3 very different kinds of territory: nostalgia, captivity, and hope. The show chose those 3 specifically, which suggests someone on the writing staff actually thought about what King represents, not just the horror, the range. The framing conceit is that Peter discovers Stephen King's writing and then imagines 3 of King's most famous stories with the Family Guy cast. That's the entire setup. 3 stories, back to back, in 22 minutes. Stand By Me, Misery, and The Shawshank Redemption. Different tones, different genres, different emotional registers. All of them adapted with more care and detail than you'd expect. Let's start with Stand By Me. The year is 1955. 4 12-year-old boys, Petey LaChance, Peter, Quag Chambers, Quagmire, Joey Duchamp, Joe, and Cleve Brown, Cleveland, set out on a journey to see a dead body. This is, almost word for word, the premise of King's novella The Body, which became the 1986 Rob Reiner film. The show's version keeps the 1950s setting, the boys doing 1950s boy things like smoking cigarettes and reading Playboy, and the specific goal of finding a corpse. Cleveland turns up with the invitation, delivered with the exact energy of someone who knows this is a once-in-a-lifetime offer. This is way better than Playboy. Do you want to see a dead body? They do, of course they do. The show nails the specific atmosphere of the King novella here. The sense of boys on the edge of something larger than themselves. A rite of passage, framed as an adventure. The mix of bravado and underlying unease. The 1950s setting is right. The dialogue rhythms are right. The casual cruelty of boyhood is right. There's a junkyard they have to pass through on the way. Old man Pritchman owns it, and is cranky because all his stuff is junk which tracks. He sets his dog on them. They get away. This is a sequence that's in the original film as well, and the show reproduces its essential shape. The threat, the running, the narrow escape, while also just doing its own version of the ornery old man joke, which is a comedy staple the show is comfortable in. The dead body turns out to be Meg. This is such a specific, perfectly calibrated Family Guy joke. You're watching a tender coming-of-age parody about friendship and mortality, and the dead body in the woods is Meg Griffin. The show's perennial punching bag deployed here as a corpse. It's mean in the way the show is often mean about Meg, but it also lands because of its complete commitment. There's no winking, no apology, just Meg, lying in the woods, described as horrid and unsightly. The bully is Mayor Adam West, which is inspired casting. Mayor West has been playing a version of himself in Quahog since the beginning, slightly disconnected from reality, prone to non sequitur, operating on his own internal logic. As an adolescent bully, he retains all of these qualities which makes him a genuinely unusual threat. Not so much dangerous as simply unpredictable in ways you can't account for. He's the kind of bully who doesn't operate on normal bully logic. He operates on Mayor Adam West logic, which is harder to anticipate and therefore, in its own way, more unsettling. The railroad bridge scene, the train coming, the boys running, is one of the better action sequences the show has produced, and it ends with Joe being unable to make the jump, because Joe is in a wheelchair, and the show is making the same joke it always makes about Joe's wheelchair. But somehow in this context it's both funnier and slightly more affecting. The kid version of Joe just sits there on the tracks and accepts it. The show doesn't tell us how he survives, it moves on. The railroad bridge sequence is actually doing something darker than it first appears. The original Stand By Me film handles this moment with genuine tension and genuine relief. The boys all make it, barely, and the emotional release is real. Family Guy reproduces the tension, but then cuts to Joe in the wheelchair on the tracks, alone, accepting his fate. The tonal jump, from genuine chase scene to character-specific comedy, is executed so quickly that you're laughing before you've had time to feel the darkness of the image. A kid in a wheelchair, sitting on railroad tracks, resigned. That image is actually quite dark. The speed of the joke is doing a lot of work to keep you from noticing. The bully, confronted by Petey's gun, backs down, then says he'll come to their house later and kill them. And the narrator, doing his best Richard Dreyfuss, acknowledges that this is a real problem. "That is a major hole in this story," he says. "Okay, take the body." It's a good laugh, but it's also making a legitimate point about the original film's resolution. The Stand By Me segment ends with the fate of each boy narrated over a final montage. Joey grows up and invents a new sport for people in wheelchairs. Cleve grows up and marries Rebecca Romin. Quag becomes a famous Hollywood actor who eventually dies of an overdose. Petey doesn't get a listed fate. The narrator just moves on. I always notice that. Now Misery, Brian as Paul Sheldon is pretty good casting on its face. Brian is a writer with literary pretensions and a slightly inflated sense of his own work, which maps neatly onto the character. The episode opens with Paul finishing his final Snuggly Jeff children's book, having decided to kill off his beloved character so he can write serious fiction. His manager's reaction is perfect. "You can just do that. Do you really need to kill the character?" Brian drives through a snowstorm. He swerves to avoid something in the road. The something turns out to be Stephen King himself, who is lying in the middle of a mountain road for unclear reasons. Brian narrowly avoids hitting him, then crashes his car anyway. And in the moment before he loses consciousness in the snow, Brian notes that this would make a neat story, then passes out, which is honestly a very Brian thing to do. He wakes up in a remote cabin being tended to by Stewie. Stewie as Annie Wilkes is the best piece of casting in the entire episode. Annie Wilkes in the original novel and film, played by Kathy Bates, who won the Academy Award for it in 1991, is a character built on misdirected intensity and explosive entitlement. Stewie already has those qualities in abundance. The cross-dressing toddler aesthetic adds something the original film didn't have, which is this layer of complete compositional wrongness. It's not just that this person has Brian captive, it's that the person is Stewie in a dress, explaining very carefully why Snuggly Jeff cannot be dead. There's a specific detail in the Misery segment that I appreciate. When Stewie forces Brian to rewrite the ending and bring Snuggly Jeff back to life, the show lets the scenes between them actually develop. Brian negotiating, Stewie holding the line, Brian finishing the book. Each exchange has the texture of a real hostage dynamic, played at low temperature, without the show constantly interrupting it with unrelated jokes. For a show that rarely sustains a single emotional register for more than 30 seconds, it's notable. The manuscript scene is faithful. Stewie finds the book, reads it, and loses his mind. The Snuggly Jeff cannot be deadline is delivered with exactly the right mixture of childish devastation and barely contained menace. Brian is forced to rewrite the ending. Confined to the cabin, no way out. The sheriff arrives. In the original film, this is a genuine moment of almost rescue. The sheriff comes close, so close, and then Annie kills him. In the Family Guy version, the sheriff is Joe, and Stewie doesn't hesitate. Stewie shoots his legs off with a shotgun and kills him, and the show adds one more beat. Now he won't have to be in a wheelchair. It's terrible. It's also extremely funny. The show has been making jokes about Joe's wheelchair for 7 seasons at this point, and this is somehow the darkest version of that joke. Brian's fate is left ambiguous. The original novel's ending is also ambiguous in its own way. The show mirrors that. Paul Sheldon survives in the book, but is permanently marked by what happened to him. Brian just isn't saved. The segment ends without resolution. That's the right call. The Shawshank Redemption. Peter as Andy Dufresne is not especially deep casting. Peter is big, blundering, and ends up imprisoned through circumstances that involve more incompetence than malice, which is at least tonally appropriate. Cleveland as Red is genuinely good. Red is the heart of the original story, and Cleveland has a quiet, observational quality that works for the role. The prison broadcast scene is the best sequence in this segment. Peter locks himself in the warden's office and puts on music for the prisoners. In the original film, it's a duet from The Marriage of Figaro, one of the most beautiful things ever committed to film, honestly. In Family Guy's version, Peter broadcasts what he considers the one true national anthem, which the show doesn't name, but allows us to hear. The prisoner's reaction is the same either way. Brief freedom, brief light. This is the show, knowing exactly what emotional note it's reaching for. Carter Pewterschmidt, as the corrupt warden, is perfect. Carter is already corrupt, already an institutionalized bully, already someone who treats other people as resources to be exploited. Putting him in a warden's uniform is almost too on the nose, but it works. Peter's escape through the sewage tunnel, in the original, it's a long nauseating crawl through 500 yards of what Red memorably describes as the worst kind of filth. In Family Guy's version, the show adds one detail. Peter chose to do this on Enchilada Night. The narrator notes that he will never understand why. This joke is extremely stupid, and it's been living in my head since 2009. The postcard. The money under the rock. Cleveland eventually getting released and following the directions. The show adds a joke here, where the directions are comically over-specific. Under a rock by a tree, super specific directions. And when Cleveland finds the money and the postcard asking him to meet Peter in Mexico, the show closes the segment with the narrator's honest assessment. I don't think they're ever going to meet again. And then Joe's legs work. Joe, who had his legs blown off in the Misery segment, is somehow fine by the time the Shawshank segment concludes. 3 for 3, baby, he says, and does something with his legs to demonstrate. The show restoring Joe's mobility across anthology segments is a small, stupid joke that I find genuinely charming every time. Three Kings is, I think, the show at its most structurally confident. It's doing 3 things in 22 minutes, and it's not cutting corners on any of them. The Stand By Me segment has genuine nostalgia in it. The Misery segment has genuine tension. The Shawshank segment has something close to genuine emotion. The music in the prison broadcast scene isn't played entirely for comedy. The show earned that moment. The Shawshank broadcast scene deserves a moment. The original film uses a piece of music, a soprano duet from Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro. And the reason it works is that the music is beautiful and incomprehensible to most of the prisoners. Red, narrating, says he doesn't know what those ladies were singing about. He liked to think it was something so beautiful it couldn't be expressed in words, something that made your heart ache. The Family Guy version uses a completely different piece of music and plays it for comedy, but the structure of the moment is identical. A piece of sound opens a portal out of suffering, however briefly, and the prisoners' faces say the rest. The show knew what that scene was doing. It reproduced the architecture of it faithfully, even while substituting the content. And Stephen King himself appears as a character in the episode. He's the thing Brian swerves to avoid in the snowstorm, which is both a reference to King's actual near-fatal car accident in 1999 and a joke about where his ideas come from. In June 1999, King was struck by a van while walking along a road in Maine and nearly died. He was in hospital for weeks. His recovery was long and painful, and his fans' response, with considerable affection it has to be said, was essentially, "Surely you can make a book out of this," which he did. That particular intersection of terrible personal experience and professional opportunity is very Brian, actually, which is maybe why the casting feels right in both directions. 3 Kings also says something about the show's relationship to its source material. Family Guy is often accused of shallow parody, of referencing things without engaging with them, of substituting recognition for thought. 3 Kings is the counter-argument to that. It doesn't just reference Stand By Me, it reconstructs the architecture of the story, finds the Family Guy cast members who fit each role, and follows the emotional logic of the original through to its conclusion. That's a different kind of engagement. It requires actually understanding what you're parodying. Whether the show always operates at that level is debatable. It clearly doesn't in a lot of episodes. The cutaway gag format often does exactly what the critics accuse it of, substituting recognition for thought, using a reference as a punchline without building anything around it. But Three Kings shows the show is capable of something more when it decides to reach for it. And that capacity, present even in a show that often doesn't use it, is part of what makes Family Guy more interesting than its reputation suggests. The episode knows what it's doing tonally. The Stand By Me segment is the most nostalgic of the three, the most warmly coloured, the one that most clearly positions itself as a tribute to childhood, rather than a deconstruction of it. The Misery segment is the most confined, the most claustrophobic, the most genuinely uncomfortable. The Shawshank segment is the most emotional, the most straightforwardly generous, with its source material's sentiment. The three pieces are calibrated differently on purpose. They're not the same episode 3 times. They're 3 distinct exercises in what happens when you put these specific characters inside these specific genre shapes. That variety is the achievement. A season earlier, season 6, 2008, the show embedded a Silence of the Lambs parody inside a larger episode. The framing device for Oscar's Guy is that the Griffins are recreating Oscar-winning films, with the specific film determined by spinning a wheel. The wheel lands on Silence of the Lambs, and what follows is a 15-minute or so adaptation that I think is actually more committed than it's usually given credit for. The framing device is, itself, a good joke. The idea that the Griffins would recreate Oscar-winning films by spinning a wheel and would treat whichever film the wheel selects with complete dedication is exactly the right level of absurdist commitment. They're not choosing Silence of the Lambs because it's a horror film. They're choosing it because the wheel said so. There's something appropriately random and slightly irresponsible about that. Lois plays Clarice Starling. This is solid casting for reasons beyond the obvious. Lois has a certain competence and resolve to her under all the domestic chaos that maps reasonably well onto Clarice's particular brand of quiet determination. She's not the most celebrated FBI trainee in the Starling-verse, but she shows up and she does the work. Stewie plays Hannibal Lecter. This is perfect casting. Not just funny, genuinely good casting. Hannibal Lecter is a character built on intellectual superiority, theatrical cruelty, impeccable manners deployed as weapons, and a kind of absolute conviction in his own taste and judgment. Stewie already has all of these qualities. The voice is different. Stewie's British accent versus Anthony Hopkins' particular Welsh RP hybrid thing. But the energy is the same. The certainty. The slight amusement at other people's limitations. The complete absence of remorse dressed up as aesthetic philosophy. The "Hello, Clarice" line lands because Stewie plays it absolutely straight. No winking. He's not doing a Hopkins impression. He's being Hannibal, and Hannibal is being Stewie, and the overlap between those two things turns out to be wider than you'd expect. Hannibal's demands before he'll help with the case are absurd. He wants Mario Lopez to record his outgoing voicemail message. The show plays this as the 1990s equivalent of some impossible request. Mario Lopez is an odd choice for an impossible demand, which is partly what makes it funny, and partly what makes it feel very specifically of a certain era of American celebrity. What would the modern equivalent be? Hard to say. Something equally random. The census taker line, in the original, one of the most chilling exchanges in the film, Hopkins delivering it with that specific terrifying stillness, is recreated here with dry Cheerios and a mashed up banana instead of fava beans and a nice Chianti. This substitution is both funnier and somehow slightly more disgusting. The visual of an elegant cannibal eating dry Cheerios off a toddler spoon is a specific kind of wrong. Meanwhile, Meg is in the pit, Chris is the Buffalo Bill figure, and the show doesn't spend much time on the pit subplot. It keeps cutting back to Stewie as Hannibal, which is the right decision, but it's there. The pit scene in the original is one of the more genuinely harrowing sequences in the film. The killer circling, the music, the night vision shot where you suddenly see the world from the killer's perspective while Clarice is completely blind. In Family Guy's version, it's mostly backdrop for the Clarice-Hannibal conversations, which is where the episode's energy actually is. There's something the show does that I appreciate. The Meg in the pit subplot is played for laughs, but the script doesn't make Meg the butt of the joke the way it normally might. The situation is already dark enough. The Meg abuse comedy is temporarily suspended in favour of just letting the plot run. It's a small restraint, and the episode is better for it. Hannibal gets moved to a new cell. He manages to escape, wearing the skin of one of the guards. The show lingers on this for a moment, the guard's skin suit, and lets it be unsettling before moving past it. This is a recurring move in the episode. Let the horror be horror for a second, then cut away. It's the right editorial instinct. The basement chase, Clarice in the dark, Chris stalking her with night vision goggles, is probably the tensest sequence the episode produces. It's also the sequence that delivers the best joke. Chris switches his goggles from night vision to nightclub mode. The green-tinged darkness becomes a strobe-lit dance floor. It's a stupid joke and it completely works. The deflation of genuine tension through stupidity is a Family Guy speciality, and it's done well here. Clarice gets her badge. She gets the call from Lecter, and Lecter delivers the final line, "I'm having an old friend for dinner," which in the original film is a moment of quiet menace. Hopkins watching his next victim from a distance, the camera pulling back. Here, Clarice doesn't understand the implication. She asks a follow-up question. She thinks he's going to eat a friend. She's confused. Lecter explains that was supposed to be the last line, and she ruined it. It's such a specific choice, the show undermining its own moment. But it works because it's honest about what Family Guy is. A show that can set up a genuinely dark note, and then, at the last second, decide to poke it instead. Not because it can't do dark, because it finds the poke more interesting. The Silence of the Lambs came out in 1991, directed by Jonathan Demme, and won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. It's one of only 3 films in history to win all 5 major awards. Family Guy gave its Hannibal Dry Cheerios a Mario Lopez voicemail and cast him as a toddler. I think Thomas Harris would probably have complicated feelings about all of that. There's a version of this analysis where I say, the Family Guy Lambs parody disrespects the original by reducing it to gags. I don't think that's right. What it actually does is identify the specific things about the original that are so strong they survive reduction. The Hannibal-Clarice dynamic, the quid pro quo structure of their conversations, the basement chase, the final line ambiguity, and then builds comedy around the frame, rather than inside it. The frame stays intact, the absurdity goes around it. The result is that when the straight moments land, the "Hello, Clarice," the census taker line, the Lecter escape, they land with genuine weight, because the show committed to them rather than undercutting them immediately. You can feel the original inside the parody. That's a more sophisticated relationship with the source material than most parody manages, honestly. Let's talk about the Halloween episodes, starting with this one, which aired in 2010 and manages to run 3 completely different storylines simultaneously, all of which end somewhere genuinely strange. Halloween as a setting suits Family Guy particularly well. The show already operates in a heightened reality. Things happen in Quahog that couldn't happen anywhere else, and the characters move through them with a particular kind of resigned acceptance. Halloween just adds one more layer of the impossible on top. Costumes change identities, normal boundaries are loosened, the neighbourhood that's familiar in every other episode becomes slightly uncanny when everyone is wearing someone else's face. It's a good canvas for a show that has always been interested in characters being caught out by the gap between who they pretend to be and who they actually are. The structure of Halloween on Spooner Street is vintage Family Guy. Multiple threads, completely different tones, occasionally intersecting, all resolving independently within the same 22 minutes. It shouldn't really work as a piece of television, and yet it does, mostly because the show has been doing this for so long that it's mastered the rhythm of threading between storylines without losing the thread of any of them. Context: Season 9, 2010. By this point, the show had been back for 5 years, deep into what is arguably its most confident period. The post-cancellation revival had given the writers permission to be bolder, stranger, less concerned with whether the show seemed respectable. Halloween on Spooner Street is from that era, and it has the looseness and energy of a show that knows exactly what it is and isn't worried about it. 3 storylines, 3 completely different registers. No connective tissue between them except that they all happen on the same night, on the same street, to people who know each other. That's enough. The show doesn't need more than that. The first thread belongs to Peter, Joe, and Quagmire. The setup delivered by Peter at the start of the episode is that every year, 2 of the 3 of them play pranks on the third, rotating who's the target. This year, it's Quagmire. Quagmire knows it. He is not handling this knowledge well. He spends the first half of the episode in a state of low-level paranoid anxiety, checking around corners, trying to stay inside. He is not successful in staying safe. The first prank finds him in what he believes is a compromising situation with a woman, and the woman turns out to be Joe in a costume. Joe's line after the reveal, Quagmire's response to it, is the kind of beat that I'll let you fill in with your imagination. The show being the show, but the prank war has a longer game being played. Peter learns something in the middle of the episode. Quagmire's grandfather was a kamikaze pilot in World War II. Peter has never heard the word kamikaze before. He mishears it the first time as kamik chameleon, and then, in the next breath, mishears it again in a different way. Both misreadings are delivered by Peter with complete sincerity. The confusion is genuine, not performed, which is what makes it land. The guys find a vintage Japanese Zero plane in an Air Force graveyard, just sitting there, apparently operational. Quagmire, who can fly, suggests they take it up. They do. The flight over Quahog starts pleasantly, Peter and Joe marvelling at the view, and then Quagmire goes quiet. His eyes change. He starts speaking in Japanese. The plane noses down toward a naval ship in the harbour. Peter and Joe are properly terrified. The show plays this completely straight. 2 men in an old plane diving at a warship, one of them apparently in some kind of ancestral trance. The fear on their faces is real. The ground is coming up fast, and then Quagmire pulls out of the dive and explains that he planned this as revenge for the earlier prank. "You know what they call this in my country?" he asks. "Payback." He's not even Japanese. He just learned the kamikaze word and decided to use it. I love this sequence more than I probably should. It commits to a genuinely frightening image. The kamikaze dive, the warship, the trance, for long enough that the prank reveal feels like actual relief. The show manufactured tension and then dissolved it, and the mechanics of that are more sophisticated than they first appear. The second thread belongs to Stewie and Brian, and it starts simply. Stewie doesn't know what Halloween is. Brian explains trick-or-treating. They go out. They collect an impressive amount of candy. And then 3 teenagers on bikes intercept Stewie, and one of them takes his bag. The teenagers are older. They have ripped jeans, which the show treats as a clear indicator of delinquency. Stewie has no candy. Brian's initial response is a reasonable, measured assessment of the situation. Maybe they should politely go and ask for it back. Explain the misunderstanding. Everybody goes home happy. Then a beat, then... First we track down those teenage hoodlums and kill them all. Brian proposes murder. Stewie doesn't object. They track the teenagers down, and Stewie threatens them with a rocket launcher, which is exactly the response a year-old psychopathic genius would have to having his Halloween candy stolen. Yes, it's that stupid kid. Now listen very carefully. The setup is perfect. Then a rock hits Stewie in the head. The rocket fires sideways into a neighbouring house, and Plan A is over. Plan B is crying for Mum. Stewie bursts into tears, screams for Lois, and Lois arrives, recovers the candy, and then demands cash from the teenager's mother as additional compensation. It's Lois at her most quietly formidable. She doesn't need a rocket launcher. She just needs to be a slightly scary mum who will stand on your doorstep and not leave until she's satisfied. The third thread is the one that's aged least comfortably, and I'll say that honestly. Meg goes to a Halloween party, plays spin the bottle, and ends up in a closet making out with someone in an Optimus Prime costume. It takes too long. The party guests drag the two of them out. The Optimus Prime mask comes off. It's Chris. The show plays this as pure horror, dramatic sting, the assembled party's collective flinch, the specific expression on Chris's face. Meg's expression, the absolute mutual horror of the situation. It's a joke built on discomfort, and the show commits to it fully. Whether you find it funny or you find it just uncomfortable is probably a matter of personal taste. The show has been doing darker-edged sibling jokes since the beginning, and this is the most extreme version of that particular bit. What I find interesting about Halloween on Spooner Street is how efficiently it manages its three tones. The prank war subplot is action comedy with a genuine tension sequence. The Stewie and Brian subplot is deadpan action comedy with a warm resolution. And the Meg subplot is pure cringe horror, played entirely for shock. Three different flavours of unsettling handled simultaneously, resolved independently, wrapped up in 22 minutes. It's not the show's most ambitious episode, but it's very competent television. There's also something the episode does that I want to note before we move on. It gives Stewie a genuine emotional experience. Stewie's first Halloween. The specific joy of trick-or-treating, the accumulated candy, the feeling of being part of something everyone participates in. Stewie has spent most of his existence either planning world domination or observing the human world from a detached, ironic distance. Halloween gives him a way in. He's not analysing the holiday, he's enjoying it. And then the teenagers take his candy, and the show pivots from innocence to action comedy in a way that's completely natural given who Stewie is. He had something. Someone took it. He wants it back. The response is disproportionate. That's Stewie. The moment where Lois arrives at the teenager's house to recover the candy is one of my favourite Lois moments in the series. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't threaten. She simply appears at the door with the specific energy of a woman who has raised 3 children and watched Peter Griffin navigate the world for 20-something years, and she demands satisfaction. The mother hands over the candy and cash without much argument. There are people in the world you just don't push back against, and Lois Griffin is one of them. This one is from Season 12, 2013, and it does something the show doesn't do very often. It takes one of its most defined characters and puts him in a situation designed specifically to mirror and reverse his usual role. Quagmire is the predator generally. Quagmire is the one with no limits, no filters, no apparent concern for whether other people are comfortable. The show has been using him this way since the beginning, and it's established such a thorough internal mythology around who he is that when the episode decides to make him the victim of someone who operates exactly the way he operates, it creates a genuinely strange watching experience. There's been an ongoing debate in discussions of Family Guy about what exactly the show is doing with Quagmire. Is he a celebration of a certain kind of male entitlement, a satire of it? The show, characteristically, has never fully committed to an answer. It lets Quagmire be both things at once, the joke and the subject of the joke, and Quagmire's Quagmire is the episode where that ambiguity is most directly addressed. The show is making Quagmire experience what his victims experience. It doesn't call it a moral lesson. It doesn't have Quagmire emerge reformed. It just puts him through the structure of it and lets the audience draw whatever conclusion they want. The episode starts domestically. Quagmire gets a new computer. He doesn't know how to use it. He calls Peter for tech support, and Peter's tech support is catastrophically unhelpful. I can't find my photos. Did you look under photos? What's that? Peter responds. It's a folder called Photos. It's like talking to his grandmother, Quagmire says, which is fair. The troubleshooting doesn't work. The computer freezes and crashes. Quagmire takes it back to the store, and when the tech looks at his browser history, which he accidentally exposes, it turns out that Quagmire's browsing has led him somewhere with a lot of malware. The tech, whose name is Sonia, has also been to that website. She has similar interests. This leads, in the most Quagmire-adjacent possible way, to a date. And here's where the episode does its most interesting structural work. It plays the first part of the Quagmire-Sonia relationship as a genuine meet-cute. They go to dinner. They bond over shared interests. Sonia says she's always been treated unfairly because of what she's into, and Quagmire, of all people, understands that. That's actually a little sad. The two of them are both people who have been defined entirely by their appetites, and this is the first time either of them has found the other. It would almost be sweet if the episode weren't about to go somewhere much darker. Quagmire wakes up handcuffed to a bed with no memory of the night. He's been drugged, and here is the specific inversion the episode is making. Quagmire, who has done this exact thing to people, has had it done to him. The show doesn't underline this. It doesn't make a speech about it. It just puts him in that position and lets the audience sit with the recognition. His response, "Are you mad?" And she says no, she's in love, plays exactly like lines from 100 Quagmire scenes, but coming from the other direction. That's on me, I should know better. These are things Quagmire has made other characters say. Now he's saying them. The relationship escalates. The guys notice the black eyes. They think she might be going too far. Quagmire assures them everything is fine. The note in his pocket, however, does not indicate that everything is fine. The note says something different. The show gives us the note briefly and moves on. The trunk scene is where the episode stops being ambiguous. Quagmire asks to slow things down, and Sonia handcuffs him, beats him, and throws him in the back of her car. The giggity, she says as she slams the boot closed, is one of the episode's darkest jokes. She's using his word, using his vocabulary, in a context where it sounds completely different. "That's my word," Quagmire says in voiceover from inside the boot. "I never thought a giggity could sound so menacing." This is a genuinely clever piece of writing. The word giggity has been Quagmire's verbal signature for the entire run of the show. It's the sound he makes when he's pleased, when something goes his way, when the world is cooperating with his appetites. It's associated entirely with Quagmire's agency, and then Sonia says it from the other side of the dynamic, with authority rather than delight, and the word means something completely different. It becomes a marker of control rather than of pleasure. The show managed to turn Quagmire's most characteristic expression against him by giving it to someone who treats him the way he treats other people. That's economical writing. Quagmire's father, Ida, who is a trans woman, in a storyline the show handled with varying degrees of grace across several seasons, comes to Peter's house, asking about Quagmire. No one's heard from him in days. They start checking his usual spots, and they find a lead, eventually, from a man who overhears them say the name Sonia. He thought they might be talking about a super kinky woman who's always down there trying to lure men to her slave shed. This is how the show delivers its expository information, sometimes. The rescue is from a storage unit. They find Quagmire hanging upside down, begging to be freed. And then Sonia shows up. She turns Joe's gun on all of them. "You don't got the boob," she says, which is a line I cannot entirely explain, but which delivers its intended comic effect. There are no bullets in the gun. Joe tackles her. She's arrested. The coda involves Ida and a revelation about Patrick that the episode drops in without slowing down. The show's commitment to keeping its emotional temperature flat, even during its most outrageous moments, is on full display here. Something genuinely alarming is revealed, and the narrator says, "Nope, moving on," and the episode ends. What Quagmire's Quagmire does that's clever is use horror movie structure. The predator, the captivity, the rescue, for a story about Quagmire, and it doesn't ask us to feel too much in any one direction about it. It's not asking us to have sympathy for Quagmire's position, but it's not asking us to enjoy his suffering either. It just puts him in the situation and lets the irony do its work quietly. And there's something the episode does at the end that I think is genuinely interesting. It doesn't resolve Quagmire differently. He comes back from this experience and he's still Quagmire. The show doesn't give him a moment of reflection, a changed perspective, a resolution to be better. He went through something that mirrored what he does to other people, and the show trusts the audience to sit with that observation without turning it into a lesson. The absence of the lesson is the lesson in a way, or it isn't, depending on what you bring to it. Family Guy, as usual, declines to arbitrate. This is the one that doesn't quite fit anywhere, and I think that's exactly the right response to it. It aired in 2011, season 10, and it was genuinely divisive at the time. People weren't sure what to make of an episode that was, underneath all the jokes, a fairly serious depiction of domestic abuse. The discomfort was sort of the point, I think, but it's worth sitting with. The episode opens on a fishing trip. Quagmire is late. When he arrives, it's because he's been distracted by something at home. The show reveals this through a quick cut, and what we see is genuinely startling, even by Family Guy standards. It sets the tone before the main story has even properly started. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire are supposed to be fishing when the call comes in. Quagmire's sister Brenda is coming to town, bringing her boyfriend, Jeff. The very first scene with Jeff establishes everything you need to know about him. They're parking. Brenda notes they're in a handicap spot. Jeff says, "Shut up and limp, we're in a handicap spot." That's it. That's the entire character, delivered in 9 words. Jeff is played entirely straight. This is the important thing about how the episode works. The show doesn't surround him with comedy. He doesn't have funny lines. He isn't used for cutaway gags. He's just a person who is relentlessly, consistently cruel to Brenda. And the show watches that happen without flinching, and without undercutting it. For a show built on the principle that almost anything can be made funny, the decision to make Jeff simply not funny is one of the most significant creative choices in the episode. There's a scene where Quagmire visits the Griffins and tries to get Lois's help. He hasn't had much luck reaching Brenda himself, and hopes that maybe another woman, someone outside the situation, might be able to get through where he can't. The acknowledgement that Quagmire doesn't know how to do this, and that he knows he doesn't know, is a quietly important character beat. Quagmire is not a man accustomed to feeling helpless. The episode is built on his helplessness. Lois takes Brenda to lunch. The black eye reveal is handled carefully. Lois notices it, Brenda deflects, says it's not that bad, only hurts when she blinks. Lois tries to get her to name what's happening. Brenda isn't ready. The show knows why. The show doesn't push. This is about as delicate as Family Guy gets, and it's delicate enough that it works. The intervention is the episode's set piece. The whole neighbourhood gathered to confront the situation, armed with support and information and good intentions. And then one of the neighbours, clearly meaning well, offers, "I feel like if he likes you, maybe you can change him." The line just sits there. Nobody responds to it. The show is trusting the audience to hear how wrong that is without being told. This is one of those moments where Family Guy's approach to dark material actually pays off. In a show with more narrative ambition, the intervention scene would probably involve someone directly challenging that line. A speech, a correction, a moment of clarity. Family Guy doesn't do that. It lets the wrong thing be said and lets it hang there, and the silence around it is more effective than any rebuttal would be. The show understands that the worst kind of advice, the kind that keeps people in dangerous situations, doesn't come from bad intentions. It comes from good intentions poorly applied. The neighbour means well. The neighbour is wrong. The show doesn't resolve that tension. It just presents it and moves on. Quagmire's plea to Brenda is one of the more earnest speeches the character has ever delivered. The show gives him a real moment, not a joke, not a cutaway, just a brother telling his sister that he loves her and he's scared for her, and it seems to work. Brenda is moved, She turns toward him. The moment is real, and then Jeff shows up, and the episode acknowledges something that a lot of well-meaning interventions don't acknowledge. Telling someone to leave doesn't mean they will. Brenda is, by the end of the episode, not only still with Jeff, but announcing that they're engaged and she's pregnant. The intervention failed. The moment of connection didn't produce the outcome everyone hoped for. That's honest in a way that makes the episode harder to watch but more truthful. The pregnancy announcement is the show's hardest beat because it takes everything the intervention worked toward. The growing closeness, the small crack of openness, the "I am so lucky to have a wonderful brother like you" moment, and places something new and heavier on top of it. It's not just that Brenda chose to stay, it's that now there's a child involved. The stakes have shifted. What was already complicated has become more complicated in the specific way that these situations become more complicated in real life. The show doesn't linger on this. It just puts it in front of you and moves on. But the weight of it is there. Lois's reaction is the one I find most honest. She doesn't argue. She doesn't deliver a speech. She just processes what she's been told in the same frame as everyone else, with the same look of quiet devastation. Lois knows when something is beyond her ability to fix. That's a quality the show gives her that it doesn't always get credit for. Peter's suggestion comes from nostalgia. Guys used to just beat down anyone who hurt their wives back in the day. Quagmire takes this seriously. "The three of us go over there," he says, "and we do what's right. We kill him." Joe is a cop. Joe technically cannot condone this. Those concerns go out the window the moment they actually watch Jeff hit Brenda. Joe says the same words the others said: "Let's waste this." The hunting trip sequence is the episode at its most tense. They get Jeff out into the woods. Quagmire's plan is exposed when Jeff overhears it. Jeff takes control of the situation quickly. He's physically dominant, he's not afraid, and he operates with the particular confidence of someone who's never experienced consequences. He disarms Quagmire. He knocks out Peter and Joe. He marches Quagmire deeper into the woods. The woods sequence is shot, or animated rather, with more atmosphere than the show usually bothers with. The trees close in. The light changes. The threat is specific and physical in a way that the show's usual violence isn't. Family Guy violence is typically cartoonish, exaggerated, quickly resolved, without weight. This isn't that. Jeff is genuinely dangerous. Quagmire is genuinely in danger. The show commits to letting that be real. The fight is not a fair one. Jeff is winning. Quagmire is getting beaten badly. And then he escapes, gets to the car, and delivers the line, "I choke myself every day, you bastard." He runs Jeff down with the vehicle. The show gives you a fraction of a second to sit with what just happened, and then it's over. The episode ends with Brenda apparently free. The show doesn't dwell on the larger implications of what the guys did. Joe is still a cop. Peter is still Peter. The status quo is restored mostly. But the episode leaves a residue that the show doesn't usually leave, because it spent 22 minutes asking you to take something seriously that the show usually doesn't take seriously. And it's not easy to just snap back to normal after that. The choice to kill Jeff rather than expose him is interesting from a writing perspective. The clean resolution, the abuser removed, Brenda freed, is also a morally compromised one. Joe breaking his own law, Quagmire committing vehicular homicide, Peter being an accomplice. The episode doesn't present this as triumphant. It presents it as the only thing they could think of to do, after everything else failed. That's a different emotional note than a revenge fantasy. And it's more honest. The guys don't feel good afterward. They just feel like it's over. I think Screams of Silence is ultimately a flawed episode that does something important. It's too blunt in some places. The resolution is vigilante in a way that's ethically complicated, and the show doesn't fully engage with those complications. But the attempt to look directly at something real and not flinch, to make a Family Guy episode that is genuinely uncomfortable in a way that has stakes, that attempt matters. The show didn't need to try this, it tried it anyway. Season 14, 2015. This one is structured as a comedy episode. It's clearly a comedy episode. There are proper jokes throughout, but it has a genuinely dark engine underneath. And the engine is this: 4 people accidentally kill a man, cover it up, and then spend the rest of the episode consumed by guilt and mutual suspicion. That's not a typical Family Guy premise. The episode opens at a horror movie. The guys have gone to see the sequel to one of their favourite horror films, and they hate it. It's a rehash. It's lazy. It recycles everything from the first film and adds nothing. They're convinced they could write something better. The show is gently making fun of every horror sequel ever made, but it's also accurately describing a real experience. The disappointment of watching something that was once effective become formulaic. They decide to brainstorm their own horror film. The ideas are bad. Peter suggests a monster cat that eats teenagers. Cleveland suggests a zombie film set in an abandoned hospital. Someone suggests a bar of soap that kills you, which is actually a premise I think has potential, and nobody explores it. The group agrees they need inspiration. Quagmire suggests the old cog asylum. Joe has the decency to note that the place has been abandoned for years and is allegedly haunted by a ghost with a hook hand. Peter dismisses this. Hook hands aren't real. They go to the asylum. There's a small thing I always notice here. The moment where they decide to go to an abandoned asylum to get inspired for a horror movie is itself a horror movie trope. They're setting themselves up. The show knows this and the characters don't. That's the gap the episode lives in. They're inside the genre without knowing they're inside the genre, which is arguably the most dangerous place to be. What follows is a pretty good haunted house sequence for a comedy show. The setting is genuinely creepy, a derelict theatre room inside an abandoned psychiatric institution. The guys start brainstorming in this deteriorating space, and it starts working on them atmospherically. The noises begin. Something is moving in the building. They try to leave and find the door locked. They crawl through a vent. They end up in the basement. And there, near an exit, is a man with a hook hand. The decision the show makes here is the central dark joke of the episode. The guys, because there are 4 of them, and only one of him, decide they can just tackle him. No dialogue, no asking questions, just collective action, overwhelming force, problem solved. They beat him to death before they find out who he is. He was the caretaker of the building. He was trying to help them find the exit. He's a decorated military veteran. The hook is from an injury sustained in service, and he's dead on the floor of the basement of the cog asylum because 4 men panicked and made a terrible decision. The episode has a lot of fun with the guys' attempts to process this. There's a dark logic to the way each of them responds. Quagmire wants confession, Joe wants burial, Peter can't quite hold the reality of it in his head long enough to have an opinion. Each reaction is completely in character. The show has spent 14 seasons establishing how these specific people process moral crises, and here it uses that knowledge for one of its blackest jokes. Quagmire wants to turn themselves in. This is the moral position. Quagmire, of all of them, is the one who says, "We have to do the right thing here." Joe, who is a police officer who enforces the law for a living, says absolutely not. They'll bury the body. They'll never speak of it again. They bury the body. They also bury his car in a second hole, because they find his car, and now they have 2 holes and 2 buried things, and a lot of soil to replace before morning. This dynamic, Quagmire as the conscience, Joe as the pragmatist overriding it, is interesting because it inverts what you'd expect. Joe is the cop. Joe should be the one insisting on doing things properly. But Joe is also the one who has spent his entire career watching the system fail, who has lived inside institutional structures long enough to have a functional rather than idealistic relationship with them. Joe's response to, "We should turn ourselves in," isn't moral, it's practical. He's done the calculation and he's decided the outcome is worse that way. Whether he's right is left entirely to the audience. Quagmire, meanwhile, who is not anyone's idea of a moral exemplar, is the one arguing for accountability. The show does this occasionally, puts its most morally compromised character in the position of advocating for the right thing, without explaining why. It's one of the ways the show avoids simple characterization. Nobody is consistently their label. Quagmire is sometimes the conscience, Peter is sometimes the heart, Brian is sometimes wrong. The show uses these reversals sparingly, and they land harder for it. The next morning sequence is an exercise in paranoid guilt. Peter comes home, and Lois says, "I know what you did last night," and he nearly collapses. She means the dishes. She means he left his dishes in the sink. The relief on his face is something. The guys are all experiencing versions of the same paranoid episode. Every innocent remark lands as an accusation. Every coincidence feels like exposure. This section of the episode is doing something that Family Guy doesn't often attempt. Sustained psychological discomfort played entirely through misunderstanding. There's no cutaway. There's no gag to break the tension. There's just Peter in a state of barely contained guilt, and Lois being Lois, and the comedy coming entirely from the gap between how loaded every word sounds to Peter and how innocent it actually is. It's well constructed. The show has done guilt before, usually as a quick joke, a brief flash of conscience before the next scene. Peter Normal Activity holds the guilt for an unusually long time, and the effect is cumulative. By the time all four guys are back at the asylum with shovels and each other's evidence, you've spent enough time with their paranoid anxiety that the release, the mutual exposure, the absurdity of all four of them having had the same idea is genuinely funny in the way that relief is funny. And then they all, independently, decide to frame Quagmire. Each of them, separately, drives back to the asylum with evidence to plant on Quagmire. Each of them arrives to find the other three already there with shovels and each other's belongings, having had the same idea. There's a moment where it almost comes to blows, and then Peter has the realization, don't you see? This is a horror movie. The story they've been living for the past 18 hours, the abandoned building, the accidental death, the cover-up, the paranoid mourning, the mutual betrayal, is a horror movie. Their actual lives have become the horror script they were trying to write. It's not a subtle joke, but it's a good one, and the show earns it by having set it up properly. You can't say the punchline hasn't been earned. Every element was placed in advance. The film gets made somehow. It's terrible. The guys have a murder on their hands, and a bad movie to show for it. The episode ends with a newspaper box. The man they killed had faked his military honours. The actual veteran credentials were someone else's. The guys use this information to feel absolved. Whether the audience shares in that absolution is, again, a matter of personal taste. Peter Normal Activity is, structurally, one of the tighter episodes Family Guy has produced. The joke is conceptually clean. Four men trying to write a horror movie accidentally end up in one, and the execution follows through. The dark engine is dark enough to give the comedy its edge. It's not trying to do anything as serious as Screams of Silence, but it knows what it is and it does it well. The ending is honest about its own genre limitations. The newspaper box reveal that the man they killed had faked his military honours is a classic get-out clause, and the show knows it's a get-out clause. That's what makes it funny rather than cheap. The episode doesn't pretend the revelation clears their conscience or resolves the moral weight of what happened. It just shows you four men latching onto any available excuse to feel better, and it lets you see them doing it, and it doesn't ask you to share in their relief. The audience knows the relief is manufactured. The characters don't care. That gap between what the characters feel and what the audience sees is where the joke actually lives. There's a version of this episode that ends on a darker note, one where the guys have to carry what they did without a convenient newspaper box. The show chose not to do that, and I think that's the right call for a comedy. But it's interesting that the get-out clause is so transparently a get-out clause. The show is being honest about its own genre limitations. This one leans more action movie than horror, but the implications of it are darker than they first appear if you think about them for a second, which I always end up doing. The setup involves a naked Peter materialising in the car park behind the drunken clam, which is a sentence that requires no additional context if you've seen any version of a Terminator film. The Terminator franchise are built around the idea of machines sent back through time to kill specific people, gets adapted here through the specific lens of Stewie and Brian's relationship, and that adaptation turns out to be surprisingly effective. Let me say a quick thing about the Terminator franchise itself before we get into the episode, because the context is interesting. The original Terminator came out in 1984, directed by James Cameron, and was essentially a slasher film with a science fiction premise, an unstoppable machine sent back in time to kill someone before they can do something important. The horror of the original is the unstoppability. It doesn't stop. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't feel remorse or fatigue. It just keeps coming. That specific horror, pursuit without end, threat that won't be deterred, is what Family Guy is borrowing, and then redirecting entirely into a story about two friends failing to communicate properly. The initial logic is this: a Terminator arrives in Quahog. Stewie sees it. Stewie immediately concludes that his future self sent it back to help him kill Lois, which is a completely reasonable conclusion for Stewie to reach. The robot approaches the house, gets inside, tries to kill Stewie. This is the first revision of the premise. The Terminator wasn't sent by Stewie. It was sent by someone who hates Stewie. That someone turns out to be future Brian, which is the second revision. Brian programmed the robot to kill Stewie as a baby. When Brian realizes this, that a future version of himself sent a killing machine back in time to murder his best friend, the show pauses on his reaction just long enough for you to feel the complexity of that. They go to the future to find out what happened. The future is standard dystopia, ruined cityscape, machinery and ash, warring factions. The two factions are Stewie robots and Brian robots, which is exactly as ridiculous as it sounds, and also somehow exactly right. Future Stewie is leading one side, future Brian is leading the other. Millions are dead. The future world in this episode is rendered with genuine commitment. It's not a quick establishing shot. The show takes its time with the ruined cityscape, with the machinery of the war, with the sense of a world that has been consuming itself for decades over a single grievance that nobody fully remembers anymore. That scale, civilization-ending conflict over a petty slight, is the joke's whole foundation, and the show earns the joke by taking the scale seriously. The robot war is absurd. The robot war is also enormous, both things at once. When Brian and Stewie meet their future selves, there's a specific dynamic at play. Their future selves have had decades to calcify the resentment. Future Stewie has built an army around the wound. Future Brian has done the same. They're not the same people. They're what the present Brian and Stewie could become if they let the small stuff compound long enough. It's a cautionary tale dressed as a robot war comedy, and the show manages both registers simultaneously without letting either overwhelm the other. The cause of the war. You need to know the cause of the war. Brian left a sarcastic comment on one of Stewie's Instagram posts. That's it. That's the thing. Stewie posted something. It's implied to be creative work of some kind, something he was proud of. And Brian responded with a sarcastic comment, rather than genuine engagement. Stewie was hurt. The hurt became resentment. The resentment scaled as resentments do, until it became something large enough to destroy a civilization. The show presents this without commentary, and the lack of commentary is the joke. When they find their future selves and ask what happened, they're told, Brian ruined what could have been a perfect Instagram post with a sarcastic comment. Millions dead over it. There is no defense. There is no additional context that makes it more complicated. A sarcastic comment. Millions dead. In 2009, when this episode aired, Instagram didn't exist. It launched in 2010. The show was being prescient in the way good satire is sometimes prescient, not predicting the specific platform, but predicting the specific dynamic. The idea that a sarcastic comment on a creative post could escalate, given enough time and mutual stubbornness into something genuinely destructive. That creative vulnerability, the specific pain of sharing something you made and having it met with sarcasm by someone close to you, is something the show identified as a genuine fault line in the Brian-Stewie relationship and projected it forward to its logical extreme. I find that quietly smart for a joke about robot wars. The road trip back to the present is where the episode finds its best material. Brian and Stewie are stuck in a car together. They're trying to prove that they don't hate each other, that their friendship is strong enough to prevent the terrible future they've just seen. And immediately, because they are who they are, they start irritating each other. Stewie's snack choices, Brian's driving, every small thing that any two people who spend a lot of time together have ever annoyed each other with, in a compressed and escalating form. It's a good bit because it's true. The things that end friendships, the real things, the daily life things, are rarely dramatic. They're usually small, accretive, the kind of thing that seems trivial and isn't. The show is making a real observation wrapped in a robot war premise. The Terminator cop pulling them over is perfect because the timing is exactly right. They're at peak tension with each other, almost back to the moment that started the war, and the threat of another machine arrives to crystallize what's at stake. Stewie's solution is the one the show is building toward, and it's both stupid and somehow genuinely sweet. They have to kiss. A proper kiss as best friends, to demonstrate to the universe, or to each other, or to whatever is tracking the emotional state of their friendship, that the love is real. Brian objects strenuously. Stewie insists. They do it. The Terminators disappear. The show doesn't make a big deal of the kiss. It's played as a practical solution to a practical problem, which is the right way to play it. But there's something underneath it that the episode earned. The entire road trip, all the bickering, all the near misses, was building to this. The moment where they had to choose, explicitly and physically, to affirm their friendship rather than let the irritations compound. The Terminator franchise cost around $400 million across its first 4 films. Stewie and Brian fixed everything with a peck in a lay-by in Rhode Island. What I find interesting about this episode, beyond the Instagram war detail, is that it's fundamentally a love story. Not a romantic love story, but a story about two people who genuinely care about each other, who express that care very badly most of the time, and who have to be confronted with the apocalyptic consequences of their failure to communicate before they can actually say what they mean. The robots are a metaphor. The future is a metaphor. The kiss is the point. Brian and Stewie's friendship is, across the full run of the show, probably the most consistently, emotionally honest relationship in the series. They irritate each other constantly. They let each other down. They are structurally incompatible in a dozen ways, and yet the show keeps coming back to the specificity of their bond, the way they talk to each other, the way they travel together, the episodes where it's just the two of them and the show drops the gag rate and lets them be people. P. Terminator is the episode that makes that friendship apocalyptically consequential. It earns the scale it reaches for. Family Guy has kept making Halloween episodes well into its later run. And the interesting thing is that the more recent ones have gotten slightly stranger in their horror choices. Not louder, stranger. The show seems more willing now to let the spooky premise sit for a little longer before diffusing it. Peter Pumpkin Cheetah is from season 23, which aired in 2021. The main plot involves a pumpkin growing competition and a scheme by Peter and Joe to hide inside a pumpkin during the judging. This is exactly as silly as it sounds. The reveal that every single entrant, including the longtime champion, has been hiding an overweight man inside their pumpkin, is a lovely piece of escalating absurdism that delivers its joke perfectly. But the horror thread in this episode belongs to Rupert. Rupert is Stewie's teddy bear. He's been there since the pilot. He is, in the show's internal logic, simply a stuffed animal. Stewie talks to him, confides in him, occasionally has full conversations with him, but it's generally understood that this is a one-sided relationship. Stewie is a baby. He has a teddy bear. Nothing unusual there. In this episode, Stewie and Brian have a falling out over a Halloween costume. It's petty, the way their arguments always start petty. Stewie, in the aftermath, takes his grievances to Rupert. He vents. He says things he might not otherwise say about Brian, about what he wishes would happen to Brian. Rupert is a stuffed animal. Rupert cannot act on anything Stewie says. Except in this episode, Stewie's attempt to animate Rupert actually works. The episode is careful about this. The spell apparently fails. No visible effect. Stewie goes to bed annoyed and wakes up the next morning, and the animation seems to have been a failure. Normal episode continues, but Rupert heard everything Stewie said, and Rupert has been awake the whole time, and Rupert has been quietly, methodically trying to kill Brian throughout the entire episode, in between scenes, while the main plot was happening with the pumpkins. When Stewie figures this out, and the episode handles the reveal beautifully, Stewie suddenly piecing together small anomalies that add up to a terrible picture, the show creates something genuinely unsettling. Not a monster in the traditional sense, not a ghost or a demon, a stuffed bear that loves Stewie absolutely, and therefore decided to destroy what Stewie said he wanted, destroyed. The horror is that Rupert was only doing what Stewie asked. Stewie drowns Rupert in the toilet. There's something genuinely sad about it, underneath the joke. Stewie isn't just fixing a problem, he's actively ending the animation he created, ending something that was, in its own way, loyal to him. The moment is brief and the show moves on, but it stays. The episode ends with Rupert coming fresh out of the dryer, and Stewie sitting down to tell him everything that happened, including the part where Stewie drowned him. Rupert apparently doesn't remember, or Stewie assumes he doesn't remember. Either way, everything is fine now, or as fine as it gets on Spooner Street. There's something genuinely strange about this episode's horror logic that I keep returning to. The scariest version of Rupert as a threat isn't that he's a monster or a supernatural force. It's that he's loyal. He heard what Stewie said about wanting Brian dead, and he decided to act on it. He was trying to do something for Stewie. The horror is in the literalism of total devotion. If you truly love someone, and they say in a moment of frustration that they want something terrible to happen, a sufficiently literal form of love might actually try to make that happen. Rupert the teddy bear as a metaphor for uncritical loyalty. Family Guy got there before I did, apparently. A Little Fright Music is from season 24, the most recent season as of this video, which premiered in October 2025. The Halloween special structure is clean and funny. Stewie is annoyed that Monster Mash is the only Halloween song, decides to write an original one, gets consumed by the lifestyle of being a songwriter, and the project falls apart. This is a Stewie storyline that could only exist in the later seasons. The baby genius who gets seduced by his own ambitions is a rich character to spend time with, and the show has had enough time to develop the nuances of that seduction. Early Stewie wanted to conquer the world. Later Stewie wants to be taken seriously as an artist. The second ambition is arguably the more recognisable one. The main event, though, is Peter and the guys. They secretly decide to go trick-or-treating outside of town without telling their wives, claiming they're at the game. They're grown men. They are trick-or-treating in another town to avoid detection. This is peak Family Guy. There's something genuinely endearing about this subplot. 4 middle-aged men going trick-or-treating because they want to, not because they're accompanying children. The show plays it for comedy. They're hiding this from their wives like it's a serious transgression, but the desire underneath it is completely sympathetic. Why shouldn't adults trick-or-treat? The only reason they don't is the social expectation that it's for children. Peter and the guys ignoring that expectation while being furtive about it as if they're committing actual crimes is both funny and a tiny bit touching. They get chased by masked serial killers into a cottage in the woods. The chase sequence is actually well constructed. The killers are credible threats, the darkness and the isolation are used properly. Peter expresses genuine remorse about having dragged Chris into this before the situation gets worse. There's a moment of actual stakes properly played, and then the killers unmask. It's Lois, Bonnie, Donna. The wives planned the whole thing to restore their Halloween spirit, which had been flagging. They had a better time setting up a fake slasher scenario than the guys had getting tricked or treating. Lois calls it a success. Stewie and Brian arrive at the end to perform their song. The reveal is elegant in its simplicity. The wives organise something more elaborate, more creative, and frankly more fun than anything the guys were doing. The episode started as a story about the guys hiding something from their wives, and it ends with the wives having done something much more interesting with the same holiday. It's a quietly satisfying inversion, and the show is smart enough to play it without underlining it. The more recent Halloween episodes feel, in a good way, like the show has relaxed into its own mythology. It knows these characters. It knows what scares them and what makes them laugh, and how to use the season. There's a confidence to the horror sequences in a little fright music that comes from all that practice. The show knows how to be properly unsettling when it wants to, and it knows, more importantly, when to be warm instead. The evolution of how Family Guy handles Halloween says something about how the show has grown. The early Halloween episode, when they happened at all, tended to be fairly standard anthology formats or one-off dark jokes. By season 9, with Halloween on Spooner Street, the show had found a formula that worked. Multiple simultaneous storylines, each taking a different tonal approach to the holiday, all resolving within the same episode. By the later seasons, it's doing something more ambitious, using the Halloween setting to explore specific things about its characters that the regular episodes can't quite access. The Rupert episode is genuinely about Stewie's psychology, specifically about the danger of saying things in private that you'd never say out loud to the person's face. The A Little Fright Music episode is about the wives' emotional lives, which the show rarely centres. Halloween, as a setting, seems to give the writers permission to go somewhere the regular episodes don't. One thing I find quietly interesting about the more recent Halloween specials, several of them aired on Hulu rather than Fox, which gave the writers more latitude in terms of content. The Hulu model, streaming, no broadcast standards, means the show can go slightly further, stay slightly longer in uncomfortable territory, handle adult content with less restraint. Whether that's visible in the horror episodes specifically is hard to say without a closer watch, but the context matters. The show has been living in two houses simultaneously for a few years now. Fox for the main broadcast run, Hulu for specials and exclusive content. And those two environments have different rules. The show seems to be learning how to use that. Family Guy has been renewed through season 28, with a deal signed in April 2025. That means at minimum 4 more seasons of whatever the show decides to do, including presumably more Halloween specials, more horror-adjacent episodes, more experiments with the format. I have no idea what direction it goes from here, but I'd be surprised if it stopped finding new ways to be dark. The show is too comfortable in that space to walk away from it. So that's a good portion of what the show has done in this particular corner of its universe. A poltergeist parody that ends with Carrot Top, a serial killer brother that the show handles more carefully than expected. 3 Stephen King adaptations in 22 minutes. A Silence of the Lambs parody that found out Stewie is perfect casting for Hannibal Lecter, which in retrospect seems obvious. Halloween Prank Wars. A Terminator conflict that started with an Instagram comment. A teddy bear that tried to be loyal and was drowned for it. The range of that is part of what I find genuinely interesting about this show's relationship with darkness. It's not consistent. It doesn't have a single approach. Sometimes it goes for pure parody, committed, affectionate, detailed. Sometimes it goes for something more uncomfortable, something that uses the comedy framework to get close to a real subject and look at it directly. Sometimes it just builds a strange premise and follows it to wherever it goes, even if that place is a robot war caused by a sarcastic comment. What they all have in common, I think, is the characters. You keep coming back to the characters. Peter and Lois and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire and Joe and Meg and Chris have 24 seasons of accumulated weight behind them. And that weight means that when the show puts them in something dark, the darkness has purchase. It can grip, even when the jokes are running alongside it, even when the show is being its most absurdist self. There are moments where the specific gravity of these specific characters makes something land in a way it wouldn't for strangers. Brian going into the ghost realm alongside Lois, Quagmire making his plea to his sister. Peter in the woods at night, genuinely afraid of what he and his friends have done. Stewie drowning Rupert in the toilet with genuine reluctance. Brian and Stewie on the side of a road, choosing to affirm their friendship rather than let it collapse into a sarcastic comment. These images carry weight because of who's in them. 20+ years of knowing these people made those moments possible. The comedy is inseparable from it. The darkness is inseparable from it. They're the same thing on Spooner Street. There are episodes we didn't get to tonight. The Stewie kills Lois two-parter from season 6 is interesting. A genuine thriller structure wrapped around a Family Guy episode, which is its own kind of experiment. The Death is a Bitch episode, where Death sprains his ankle, is quietly one of the stranger early season pieces. The various Brian storylines that touch on mortality and impermanence in ways the show doesn't always announce. There's a lot of ground left to cover, and I have thoughts about most of it that could fill another video, maybe more than one. But that's for another night. There's one more thing I want to mention before we close out, because it connects everything we've talked about tonight, and I don't want to leave it unsaid. The reason these darker episodes land, the reason they work at all, inside a show that also features a man getting repeatedly beaten up by a giant chicken, is that the show has never fully committed to being a cartoon in the dismissive sense of the word. It's never fully agreed that what happens in Quahog doesn't matter, because none of it is real. The writers have, over the run of the show, found moments to let the reality in. Quagmire genuinely loves his sister. Lois genuinely goes into the ghost realm to bring Stewie home. Peter genuinely terrifies himself in the woods because he's covering up a man's death. Brian and Stewie genuinely have to affirm their friendship to stop a future catastrophe. These aren't parody moments. They're real moments inside parody episodes, and they change what the parody episodes are. They make the comedy darker and the darkness funnier. They make the whole thing, somehow, more honest. That's Quahog. That's the show. A place where things are fine and terrible in roughly equal measure, and the characters keep showing up anyway. For now, the TV light is still on in that house, on Spooner Street. Peter is probably asleep on the couch. Brian is probably reading something and feeling slightly smug about it. Stewie is probably in his room, building something that will cause problems. The skull is buried where it belongs. The ghosts went home. The Terminators disappeared. Everyone came back from the woods. It works out on Spooner Street. It always works out. That's the deal. And that particular deal, the implicit promise that no matter how dark things get inside the episode, the credits will roll and the characters will all be fine for the next one, is, I think, exactly what you want to fall asleep to. Take care of yourselves. Sleep